There comes a moment in some relationships when the fog begins to lift. It may not happen dramatically. There may be no single confession, no cinematic confrontation, no moment where the other person suddenly stands before you and admits everything. Sometimes the truth arrives quietly. You notice the pattern. You notice how you feel after conversations. You notice how often you are apologizing for things you did not do. You notice how frequently their pain becomes your responsibility, while your pain somehow becomes an inconvenience. And one day, perhaps after months or even years of confusion, something inside you whispers, "I finally see it." And when you finally see it, listen carefully. You do not necessarily need to announce that you see it. You do not need to gather evidence like a prosecutor preparing a courtroom case. You do not need to sit across from them and say, "I know who you really are." You do not need to force them to acknowledge your interpretation. You do not need to expose every contradiction, reveal every manipulation, or convince every person around them that your experience was real. Sometimes you need to run, but run quietly. Not because you are weak, not because you are afraid, not because they have won. You run quietly because your peace is more valuable than the argument you could have. You run quietly because your healing does not require their participation. You run quietly because there are situations in which explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding, you only gives them more material to manipulate, debate, distort, or use against you. And I want you to understand something important from the beginning. This is not about diagnosing someone from a distance. Not every selfish person is a narcissist. Not every emotionally unavailable person has narcissistic personality disorder. Not every difficult relationship involves narcissistic abuse. Psychological language should be used carefully. But unhealthy patterns are real. Manipulation can be real. Emotional abuse can be real. And your experience of repeatedly feeling diminished, controlled, confused, or unsafe deserves to be taken seriously. So today we are going deeper than the label. We are talking about what happens when you begin to recognize the hidden dynamics of a counterfeit relationship. We are talking about the person who may appear kind in public, but repeatedly invalidates you in private. The person who may present themselves as deeply sensitive while being remarkably insensitive to your needs. The person who may tell everyone how much they have sacrificed while quietly making you feel guilty for having boundaries. The person who may seem humble while constantly needing admiration. The person who may appear wounded while using that woundedness to avoid accountability. And perhaps, most importantly, we are talking about you, because there is a part of this story that has nothing to do with changing them and everything to do with recovering you. Maybe you have spent too long trying to understand why someone could be so loving one day and so cold the next. Maybe you have replayed conversations in your mind, asking yourself what you could have said differently. Maybe you have become an expert at reading their mood before entering a room. Maybe you learned when to speak, when to remain silent, when to apologize, when to give them space, when to reassure them, when to absorb their anger, and when to pretend that something did not hurt. Maybe you became incredibly skilled at maintaining the relationship while slowly disappearing inside it. That is one of the tragedies of emotionally manipulative relationships. You can become so focused on preventing the next conflict that you stop asking whether the relationship itself is healthy. You become a manager of another person's emotions. You become a translator of their behavior. You become a defender of their reputation. You become a negotiator for basic respect. And eventually, you may realize that you are doing the emotional labor for two people while receiving very little emotional safety in return. That realization can be painful, but it can also be the beginning of freedom. A counterfeit relationship does not necessarily mean that every moment was fake. That is important. You may have experienced genuine affection, genuine laughter, genuine memories, genuine chemistry, and genuine hope. Human relationships are complicated. A person can have positive qualities and still participate in profoundly unhealthy patterns. Someone can experience their own pain and still hurt another person. Someone can believe they love you and still behave in ways that are emotionally destructive. You do not have to erase every good memory to acknowledge the bad pattern. You do not have to declare that every smile was fake. You do not have to rewrite your entire history. You only have to become honest about what the relationship consistently does to your life. Ask yourself, who do I become around this person? Do I become smaller? Do I become quieter? Do I second guess myself? Do I constantly monitor their reactions? Do I feel guilty for having ordinary needs? Do I feel as though affection must be earned? Do I feel that peace exists only when I agree with them? Do I feel like I am always explaining my intentions while they rarely examine theirs? Do I feel emotionally exhausted after interactions that are supposed to feel loving? These questions matter because sometimes your mind is still negotiating with what your body has already recognized. You may tell yourself, they love me, and perhaps they do in whatever way they understand love. But another question remains. Is this relationship loving me? That is different. Because love is not merely an emotion someone claims to feel. A healthy relationship requires behavior that allows both people to experience dignity, safety, autonomy, honesty, and mutual respect. You cannot build a healthy relationship solely on someone's intentions. And you cannot heal an unhealthy relationship simply by becoming more understanding. There is a point where understanding becomes self-abandonment. You understand their childhood. You understand their insecurities. You understand their fear of rejection. You understand why they withdraw. You understand why they become defensive. You understand why they need reassurance. You understand why they are sensitive to criticism. You understand why they react strongly. You understand everything. But who understands you? Who asks what all of this is doing to you? Who protects your emotional reality? Who notices that while you are becoming increasingly compassionate toward their wounds, you are becoming increasingly cruel toward your own? This is where your awakening begins. Not with hatred, not with revenge, not with exposing them, with honesty. You begin saying, I can understand your pain without volunteering to be harmed by it. That sentence can change your life. You can have compassion without access. You can forgive without reconciliation. You can understand without returning. You can wish someone healing without remaining close enough to be wounded by their behavior. And you can leave without proving that they are a bad person. This is one of the most difficult lessons for people who have been conditioned to over-explain themselves. You are allowed to leave a relationship because it is unhealthy for you. You do not need a unanimous vote. You do not need their permission. You do not need their agreement. You do not need a final conversation where everything finally makes sense. Sometimes closure is not a conversation. Sometimes closure is the moment you stop asking the person who confused you to explain why you were confused. Think about how powerful that is. For so long, you may have believed that if they would just tell you the truth, everything would make sense. If they would just admit what they did, you could heal. If they would just apologize sincerely, you could finally move forward. But what happens when the person you need closure from is also the person who repeatedly denied your experience? You become trapped because you are waiting for the source of your confusion to become the source of your clarity. And that may never happen. Your clarity may have to come from you. You may have to look at the pattern and say, I don't need another explanation. You may have to say, I have enough information. You may have to say, I don't know exactly why they behave this way, but I know how the relationship affects me. That is enough. You do not need to become a psychologist to leave an unhealthy relationship. You do not need to become an investigator. You do not need to diagnose. You need to listen to your lived experience. And this is especially important when dealing with covert forms of manipulation. Covert manipulation can be difficult to identify because it may not look like obvious aggression. Instead, it can appear as helplessness, martyrdom, subtle guilt, strategic withdrawal, chronic victimhood, passive-aggressive comments, selective vulnerability, or repeated reminders of everything the person has supposedly done for you. You ask for something reasonable, and suddenly you are selfish. You establish a boundary, and suddenly you are cruel. You express hurt, and suddenly they are the injured party. You ask for accountability, and suddenly they are telling you how much you have disappointed them. You stop overfunctioning, and suddenly they accuse you of changing. You stop rescuing them, and suddenly you become the villain. This reversal can make you question yourself. You may think, maybe I really am selfish. But sometimes what changed was not your character. What changed was your availability. You stopped giving unlimited access. And when someone has become accustomed to your unlimited emotional labor, your boundaries may feel to them like rejection. That does not automatically mean you are doing something wrong. A boundary is not punishment. A boundary is information. It says, this is what I will participate in, and this is what I will not. You cannot control whether someone respects the boundary. You can control what you do when they do not. That is where empowerment begins. Maybe your boundary is, I will not continue a conversation while I am being insulted. I will not explain the same decision repeatedly. Maybe it is, I will not discuss private matters with people who use them against me. Maybe it is, I will not respond immediately to emotionally provocative messages. Maybe it is, I will communicate only about necessary practical matters. And sometimes the boundary is distance. Sometimes it is no contact. No contact is often misunderstood as a tactic designed to make another person suffer. That is not the healthiest reason to do it. No contact is not supposed to be a psychological weapon. It is not supposed to be a secret experiment where you wait to see whether they will chase you. It is not supposed to be a countdown until they apologize. No contact is about reclaiming your attention, because attention is one of the most valuable things you have. Every time you check their social media, reread their message, wait for their response, analyze their silence, ask mutual friends about them, or imagine what they are thinking, some portion of your mental energy remains tied to the relationship, and healing requires that energy to come home. You have been giving enough. Bring your attention back. Bring your curiosity back. Bring your imagination back. Bring your future back. Bring your life back. If you cannot have complete no contact because you share children, employment, finances, family obligations, or other responsibilities, you can still create emotional boundaries. Communication can become brief, factual, predictable, and focused on what actually needs to be addressed. You do not have to attend every emotional battle simply because someone invites you into one. Not every accusation requires a defense. Not every provocation requires an answer. Not every misunderstanding requires correction. Not every insult deserves your attention. There is freedom in realizing that you do not have to respond to everything that is said about you. And I know this is difficult because if you are a conscientious person, you may have been trained to explain yourself. You want people to understand your heart. You want fairness. You want to be seen accurately. So when someone misrepresents you, every instinct says, correct the record. But sometimes trying to correct the record keeps you trapped in the relationship. You keep explaining. They keep moving the goalpost. You answer one accusation, 3 more appear. You clarify one event. They reinterpret another. You provide context. They question your motives. And suddenly, the conversation is no longer about what happened. It is about defending your right to exist as a person with your own perspective. At some point, you have to step out. You can say, I know what I experienced. You can say, I don't need you to agree with my memory. You can say, You are entitled to your interpretation, and I am entitled to mine. And then you stop. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes silence is the boundary that finally protects the truth you have already understood. This is why I say, when you unmask the pattern, run quietly. Don't run toward revenge. Run toward peace. Run toward therapy if you have access to it. Run toward trusted people. Run toward sleep. Run toward your routines. Run toward financial independence where possible. Run toward your hobbies. Run toward your children. Run toward your health. Run toward your creativity. Run toward the parts of yourself that existed before you became consumed by managing someone else's emotions. Because one of the most devastating consequences of emotional manipulation is that your life can become organized around another person's psychology. You wake up thinking about them. You go to sleep thinking about them. You plan conversations around them. You choose clothes around their reactions. You make decisions around their mood. You measure your words. You monitor your tone. You anticipate accusations. You calculate consequences. And eventually, you forget what spontaneity feels like. You forget what it feels like to breathe without checking whether someone is upset. Healing means learning that freedom again. At first, peace may feel unfamiliar. That is something nobody tells you. When you leave a chaotic relationship, calm can feel strange. You may mistake calm for loneliness. You may mistake consistency for boredom. You may mistake healthy communication for lack of passion. You may even miss the intensity, not because the intensity was healthy, but because your nervous system became accustomed to unpredictability. When affection comes and goes unpredictably, the moments of warmth can feel extraordinarily powerful. You wait for the good version to return, and when it returns, relief can feel like love. But relief is not the same thing as security. A relationship should not have to break your heart repeatedly just to make you appreciate the moments when it stops hurting. You deserve consistency. You deserve emotional safety. You deserve conversations where disagreement does not become character assassination. You deserve boundaries that are not treated as betrayals. You deserve affection that does not require you to perform. You deserve relationships where you can say, "That hurt me," without immediately becoming the accused. And if you have lived for a long time without those things, you may need time to believe that they are possible. Give yourself that time. Healing is not a performance. You do not have to wake up one morning and suddenly be completely detached. You may still miss them. You may still think about them. You may still wonder whether they will change. You may still feel angry. You may still feel sad. You may even feel guilty. None of that means you made the wrong decision. Grief does not mean you should go back. Missing someone does not mean they were good for you. Remembering beautiful moments does not erase painful ones. And loving someone does not obligate you to remain in a relationship that is damaging you. Let yourself grieve. Grieve the person you hoped they would become. Grieve the relationship you thought you were building. Grieve the future you imagined. Grieve the version of yourself who believed that if you loved harder, explained better, sacrificed more, stayed calmer, forgave faster, or became more understanding, everything would eventually become healthy. You were trying to make something work. That does not make you foolish. It makes you human. But there comes a point when persistence stops being devotion and becomes self-abandonment. That is the point where you must choose yourself. Not because you are better than anyone. Not because you want them to suffer. Not because you want to prove a point. Because your life matters. Your emotional health matters. Your dignity matters. Your future matters. And you cannot build a peaceful future while continuously negotiating with the same pattern that destroyed your peace in the past. This is where the counterfeit relationship begins to lose its power. Not when they finally understand, when you stop needing them to understand. Not when they finally apologize. When you stop making your healing dependent on an apology. Not when everyone believes you. When you believe yourself. Not when they stop talking about you. When you stop organizing your life around what they might say. That is freedom. And freedom may feel quiet. At first, painfully quiet, but stay with it, because quiet does not mean empty. Quiet means there is finally room for your own voice. You may discover that you have opinions again, preferences again, dreams again, energy again. You may realize you had forgotten what you liked because so much of your life was spent asking what would keep someone else happy. You may discover that you enjoy simple things, a peaceful morning, a meal without tension, a conversation without hidden meaning, a day without emotional emergencies, a phone that does not make your heart race, a home where you do not have to monitor someone's mood. These ordinary moments can become extraordinary when you have lived too long in emotional uncertainty. And please understand this. You do not have to become cold to protect yourself. You do not need to stop caring. You do not need to become suspicious of everyone. You do not need to assume every difficult person is narcissistic. You do not need to turn your heart into stone. Your goal is discernment, not bitterness. Your goal is boundaries, not walls around every part of yourself. Your goal is wisdom. You can become softer and stronger at the same time. You can remain compassionate while becoming harder to manipulate. You can remain loving while becoming unwilling to tolerate disrespect. You can remain generous without giving everyone unlimited access to you. You can remain kind without abandoning yourself. That is mature strength. And perhaps the most important boundary you will ever establish is the boundary against self-betrayal. You promised yourself that you would listen to your own discomfort. You promised yourself that you would stop explaining away repeated disrespect. You promised yourself that you would stop confusing potential with reality. You promised yourself that you would no longer beg for basic consideration. Keep that promise, Because every time you override your own perception to preserve someone else's comfort, you teach yourself that your reality does not matter. And every time you honor a reasonable boundary, you teach yourself the opposite. You teach yourself, I can trust me. That trust is priceless. Maybe you spent years asking, am I overreacting? Now ask, what pattern am I responding to? Maybe you asked, do they really love me? Now ask, how do I consistently experience this relationship? Maybe you asked, why won't they change? Now ask, what choice do I have if they don't? Maybe you asked, how can I make them understand? Now ask, what do I need to understand? These questions shift your life from helplessness to agency. You cannot control another person's self-awareness. You cannot control whether they seek treatment. You cannot control whether they apologize. You cannot control whether they tell the truth about the relationship. You cannot control whether they find another person. But you can control whether you continue participating in a pattern that harms you. And that is enormous power. Do not underestimate the power of a decision. A quiet decision can change an entire life. You do not have to announce it. You do not have to post it. You do not have to threaten anyone with it. You simply live it. You stop explaining. You stop chasing. You stop rescuing. You stop arguing with distortions. You stop offering intimate information to people who weaponize vulnerability. You stop trying to earn what should have been freely given. You stop auditioning for love, and slowly you become yourself again. This is what emotional detachment really means. It does not mean you feel nothing. It means your feelings no longer control your decisions. You may feel angry and still choose not to engage. You may feel lonely and still refuse to return. You may miss them and still maintain distance. You may wonder about them and still build your life forward. You may care and still say no. That is emotional maturity. The goal is not to eliminate emotion. The goal is to stop allowing emotion to override wisdom. And when the urge to go back comes, remember the entire picture. Do not remember only the apology. Remember what happened afterward. Do not remember only the romantic beginning. Remember the emotional climate of the relationship. Do not remember only the promises. Remember the patterns. Do not remember only who they could be. Remember who they repeatedly chose to be in your lived experience. This does not require hatred. It requires honesty. And honesty may hurt before it heals. There may be days when your mind romanticizes the past. On those days, do not attack yourself. Your brain is searching for familiarity. It may remember the laughter before it remembers the anxiety. It may remember the affection before it remembers the confusion. It may remember the beautiful trip before it remembers the emotional exhaustion that followed. Let the memory come. Then let the whole memory come. Not just the highlight reel, the whole story. Because healing is not about convincing yourself that everything was terrible. Healing is about becoming capable of seeing everything clearly, the good, the bad, the beautiful, the painful, the hope, the disappointment, the connection, the manipulation, the dreams, the reality, all of it. And then saying, even though some parts were beautiful, this relationship was not healthy enough for me to remain. That sentence is powerful because it does not require you to hate anyone. It simply requires you to value yourself. Maybe the hardest thing you will ever do is walk away from someone who occasionally gives you exactly what you have been begging for. Because intermittent kindness can keep hope alive. You think, maybe this time they understand. Maybe this time they will change. Maybe this time the relationship will stabilize. Maybe this time the apology is different. Maybe this time they finally see me. And maybe there are moments of genuine change in some relationships. People can grow. People can take accountability. People can seek help. People can change patterns. But real change is not demonstrated by one emotional conversation. It is demonstrated over time. It is demonstrated through consistent behavior. It is demonstrated through accountability without excuses. It is demonstrated by respecting boundaries even when those boundaries are inconvenient. It is demonstrated by taking responsibility without making you responsible for their feelings about being held accountable. And you are allowed to evaluate change based on behavior rather than promises. That is wisdom. Do not let anyone pressure you into trusting words when your experience is telling you to observe actions. You can listen. You can observe. You can take your time. You do not owe immediate access simply because someone says they have changed. And if you decide that distance is necessary, you do not have to justify that decision endlessly. Your boundary can be simple. I am not continuing this relationship. I am not available for this conversation. I will communicate only about necessary matters. I have made my decision. Sometimes the most powerful sentence is also the shortest. And then comes the uncomfortable part. You have to tolerate their reaction because boundaries are easy to state and difficult to maintain when another person becomes upset. They may accuse you. They may call you selfish. They may tell others a different version. They may suddenly become affectionate. They may promise everything. They may become angry. They may become sad. They may present themselves as the victim, and you may feel the old reflex rising inside you. I need to fix this. Pause, breathe. You are not responsible for regulating every emotion another person experiences in response to your healthy boundary. Their disappointment is not automatically evidence that your boundary is wrong. Their anger is not automatically evidence that you were cruel. Their sadness does not automatically create an obligation for you to return. This is not permission to be heartless. It is permission to recognize that adults have emotional responsibility for themselves. You can communicate respectfully. You can be considerate. You can avoid unnecessary cruelty, and you can still leave. That is the balance. Run quietly, but run with dignity. Do not destroy what you are trying to escape. Do not become consumed with exposing them. Do not spend years trying to make them regret losing you. Your life is not a revenge project. Your healing is not a performance for an audience. Your success is not measured by whether they notice. Your freedom is measured by whether you can wake up and live without needing their reaction. Imagine that day. You wake up, and they are no longer the first thought. You make breakfast without wondering what they would say. You make plans without asking whether they will approve. You laugh without guilt. You rest without waiting for the next crisis. You meet someone new and do not immediately assume that every kindness has a hidden price. You receive a compliment without questioning it. You make a mistake without expecting punishment. You say no without writing a 5-paragraph explanation. That is what healing can begin to look like. Not becoming invulnerable, becoming free. And perhaps one day you will look back and realize something astonishing. You were not difficult to love. You were trying to be loved inside a dynamic that repeatedly made love conditional. You were not too sensitive. You were responding to experiences that hurt. You were not crazy. You were confused because contradictory behavior creates confusion. You were not weak because you stayed. You were trying to survive, understand, hope, and make sense of something that mattered deeply to you. And now you know better. Do not punish the version of yourself who did not know what you know today. That person deserves compassion too. You stayed because you hoped. You explained because you cared. You forgave because you believed people could change. You tried because you valued commitment. You gave because giving is part of who you are. Those qualities are not weaknesses. They simply need boundaries. Your compassion needs discernment. Your loyalty needs standards. Your generosity needs limits. Your forgiveness needs wisdom. Your love needs reciprocity. And your heart needs a home where it is safe to remain open. So if you have unmasked a counterfeit relationship, do not rush to become obsessed with the person behind the mask. Become obsessed with recovering yourself. Study your own patterns. Ask why you tolerated certain behaviors. Ask what early warning signs you ignored. Ask where you abandoned your boundaries. Ask what you can learn without blaming yourself. Not because you caused their behavior. You did not. But because your future deserves the lessons. Maybe you learned that intense chemistry is not the same as compatibility. Maybe you learned that vulnerability is not automatically emotional maturity. Maybe you learned that someone talking about their wounds does not mean they know how to handle yours. Maybe you learned that a person can appear deeply self-aware while avoiding accountability. Maybe you learned that being needed is not the same as being loved. Maybe you learned that peace is a better foundation for intimacy than emotional intensity. Carry those lessons forward. Do not carry the person forward. Carry the wisdom. And when you eventually meet healthier people, do not punish them for what someone else did. Give yourself permission to learn a new rhythm. A healthy relationship may feel different. There may be less guessing, less anxiety, less chasing, less proving, less emotional theater, more conversation, more consistency, more repair, more mutuality, more respect. And if you have been conditioned to equate intensity with love, healthy consistency may initially feel unfamiliar. Let it. You are learning a new language, the language of safety, the language of reciprocity, the language of boundaries, the language of self-respect, the language of I can love you and still be myself. That is the relationship you are moving toward. And if you are still in the relationship right now, do not make a reckless decision simply because you heard a motivational speech. Consider your circumstances carefully. If there are safety concerns, seek appropriate professional or local support and make a plan suited to your situation. If you share finances, children, housing, employment, or other responsibilities, thoughtful preparation may matter. You do not have to make every decision tonight, but you can begin tonight by telling yourself the truth. You can stop lying to yourself about how you feel. You can stop minimizing the pattern. You can stop calling emotional exhaustion just a rough patch when the rough patch has become the landscape. You can stop confusing potential with partnership. You can stop waiting for someone else's permission to take your own pain seriously. And perhaps your first act of freedom is simply this. I believe myself. Say it again. I believe myself. Not every thought you have is necessarily accurate. Not every interpretation is perfect. But your repeated experience deserves examination, not automatic dismissal. You are allowed to gather information. You are allowed to seek professional perspective. You are allowed to reconsider. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to stay temporarily while you prepare. You are allowed to establish boundaries. You are allowed to stop explaining. You are allowed to protect your peace. And you are allowed to build a life that does not revolve around someone else's emotional instability. This is the part where the story changes. At the beginning, you were asking, why did they do this to me? Now you ask, what do I need to do for myself? At the beginning, you were asking, do they miss me? Now you ask, do I miss who I was? At the beginning, you were asking, will they regret losing me? Now you ask, will I regret losing myself if I go back? That question can wake you up because the greatest loss in a destructive relationship may not be losing the other person. It may be losing yourself, your confidence, your voice, your intuition, your friendships, your ambitions, your joy, your ability to trust your own judgment, your ability to rest, your ability to believe that love can be peaceful. Take those things back, one by one, not dramatically, quietly, just as quietly as you walked away. Read the book, take the walk, call the trusted friend, return to the hobby, organize your finances, create your routine, get professional support if you can sleep, move, eat, move your body. Write down what happened so your future self does not have to rely on a distorted memory when loneliness arrives. Build a life so full of reality that you no longer need to live inside the fantasy, because that is what the counterfeit relationship often demands. That you remain loyal to a fantasy while ignoring the evidence of your daily experience. You were loyal to who they could become. Now become loyal to who you can become. You were patient with their potential. Now be patient with your healing. You gave them endless chances. Now give yourself a chance. You forgave them repeatedly. Now forgive yourself for staying longer than you wish you had. You were always trying to understand them. Now understand yourself. And when the temptation comes to go back because you are lonely, remember this. Loneliness is a feeling. It is not a command. Confusion is a feeling. It is not a command. Guilt is a feeling. It is not a command. Missing someone is a feeling. It is not a command. You can feel something deeply without obeying it. That is emotional freedom. And there may come a morning when you realize you have gone an entire day without thinking about them, then 2 days, then a week. And eventually you will realize that you are not counting anymore. That is healing. Not because you stopped caring about what happened, because what happened stopped controlling what happens next. Your past becomes information instead of a prison. Your memories become lessons instead of chains. Your boundaries become natural instead of frightening. Your standards become clearer. Your self-respect becomes stronger. And you understand that walking away was never about defeating another person. It was about refusing to defeat yourself. So if you are standing at that threshold today, take a breath. You do not have to make noise. You do not have to expose everything. You do not have to win the final argument. You do not have to convince the world. You need to protect the life you still have. Run quietly. Run intelligently. Run with support. Run with a plan. Run without revenge. Run toward peace. And if you cannot physically leave yet, begin creating emotional and practical space where it is safe to do so. Strengthen your support system. Protect your important information. Think carefully about your resources. Seek qualified professional or legal guidance when your circumstances require it. Your safety comes before proving a point. And then, little by little, choose yourself. Choose yourself when your boundary feels uncomfortable. Choose yourself when they accuse you of changing. Choose yourself when they suddenly become charming. Choose yourself when nostalgia appears. Choose yourself when loneliness whispers. Choose yourself when guilt arrives. Choose yourself when someone says you are selfish for finally protecting yourself. Choose yourself, not because you are perfect, because you are human, because your life deserves to be lived, because your heart deserves relationships where it does not have to beg for basic respect, because your future deserves a version of you who is awake. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson in all of this. The goal is not to become someone who can identify every narcissist in the room. The goal is to become someone who recognizes when a relationship is unhealthy and trusts themselves enough to respond. You do not need to become an expert in narcissism. Become an expert in your own boundaries. Become an expert in what respect feels like. Become an expert in recognizing consistency. Become an expert in noticing whether accountability is mutual. Become an expert in listening when your body tells you that something feels wrong. Become an expert in walking away from patterns that repeatedly diminish you. That is enough. You do not need to know exactly what is happening inside another person's mind. You need to know what is happening inside your own life. And if your life has become smaller, quieter, more anxious, more confused, more exhausted, and more centered around someone else's needs, that deserves your attention. Your life should not be a permanent emergency. Love should not require you to abandon your identity. Compassion should not require you to tolerate manipulation. Forgiveness should not require continued access. And leaving does not require hatred. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop participating. So today, let the mask fall. But do not stand there staring at the person underneath it. Turn around, walk away, and start looking at the person you are becoming. That person is still there, under the anxiety, under the confusion, under the guilt, under the years of self-doubt, under the emotional exhaustion. You are still there. Your voice is still there. Your dreams are still there. Your standards are still there. Your capacity for joy is still there. Your future is still there. You may have been distracted from yourself, but you were never permanently lost. And now you know something you did not know before. You know what it costs you to abandon yourself. You know what confusion feels like. You know what inconsistency feels like. You know what manipulation can look like. You know what emotional exhaustion feels like. And because you know, you can choose differently, not perfectly, differently. You can build differently, love differently, communicate differently, set boundaries differently. And most importantly, you can remain yourself while loving someone else. That is the freedom you were looking for, not the freedom to make them suffer. The freedom to stop suffering for their approval, not the freedom to make them jealous. The freedom to stop measuring your worth through their attention. Not the freedom to expose them, the freedom to stop needing their confession. Not the freedom to win, the freedom to leave the competition entirely. You do not have to prove that you were valuable. You were valuable before they recognized it. You were valuable when they praised you. You were valuable when they criticized you. You were valuable when they stayed. You were valuable when they left. Their perception never created your worth, and it cannot destroy it. So walk forward quietly, steadily, with dignity. Let your healing become louder than your explanation. Let your peace become stronger than your anger. Let your boundaries become clearer than your fear. Let your future become more important than your past. And one day, you may look back at the person you were during those difficult years and feel something unexpected. Not shame, compassion. You may say, "You were doing the best you could with what you understood then." And then you will smile, because you will realize that the relationship did not get the final word. The manipulation did not get the final word. The confusion did not get the final word. The rejection did not get the final word. The counterfeit relationship did not get the final word. You did. Your choices did. Your healing did. Your boundaries did. Your courage did. And your life will continue to speak long after the relationship has become a chapter instead of a daily reality. So, if you needed permission today, let this be it. You are allowed to choose peace. You are allowed to step back. You are allowed to stop explaining. You are allowed to protect your emotional space. You are allowed to seek help. You are allowed to grieve. You are allowed to heal slowly. You are allowed to become someone new. And you are allowed to walk away quietly from anything that repeatedly asks you to betray yourself in order to keep it. You do not need revenge. You need recovery. You do not need their regret. You need your freedom. You do not need their apology. You need your peace. You do not need them to admit who they were. You need to remember who you are. And when you remember who you are, the counterfeit relationship loses its power. Because the moment you stop asking, "How do I make this person love me correctly?" and start asking, "How do I love myself responsibly?" everything begins to change. That is your turning point. That is your awakening. That is your quiet exit. And that is where your life begins again.